It's no secret that a ton of Magic the Gathering players aren't thrilled with the direction that the game is headed in. We kind of have to admit that it's unlikely that Wizards of the Coast is going to change anything as long as this new direction continues to work. If you're a player who's suddenly finding that Magic isn't really the game for you anymore, what can you do? Well, Mark Rosewater offered some advice on his blog. He says, the most effective thing you can do is purchase, play, and talk about the things you enjoy. The metrics we pay the most attention to, other than market research, are sales, play, and online discussion. But in order for us to support the things that we love about Magic the Gathering, we need opportunities to do so. And those opportunities seem to be rapidly disappearing. And so this weird dynamic gets created where the ways of playing the game that were the ways that we used to love are suddenly out of the spotlight, and it's difficult to sort of change course when the new players don't really get the opportunity to see what the game used to be like. Just this year, we would have only had 2 in-universe sets, Strixhaven and Reality Fracture, if Lorwyn hadn't been delayed to the beginning of this year. And when we look at the most powerful cards that are currently in the game, most of them are from Universes Beyond, as well as the most expensive chase collectible cards, like the Chocobos and the Stones from the Marvel sets. In a lot of ways, it does feel like Wizards of the Coast is kind of putting their thumb on the scale here, right? Like, you're telling us to support the parts of the game that we love while giving us fewer opportunities to do that. So it feels like the game is inevitably going to move in a direction that is not necessarily the type of game for us. The question is, what can we do? And it seems like the path forward might be for players themselves to create formats for the game. These are things like Pre-Modern, Canlander, and even Commander, which is the most popular way to play Magic the Gathering now. So let's discuss player-made formats, what they need to succeed, and the big problem with this direction.
Distraction makers.
So player-made formats aren't a new idea. They're not even a new idea to Magic the Gathering. Within Magic, we have things like Pre-Modern, Canlander, a bunch of different legacy variants that have started to pop up, and most famously, Commander being a fan-made way to play the game. These also can be things that aren't even necessarily formats. Things like Dan are almost their own self-enclosed game. But really the thing that these all have in common is that the players of the game themselves are using the game pieces from the game in kind of a new way to either bring back the type of gameplay that they enjoyed most with Magic, or use it to invent some totally new way to play the game. So it does appear that the goal of these player-made formats is eventually to get sort of company acceptance so that the formats can be officially supported by the company themselves. We'll come back to this, but this really is part of the big problem with this whole idea. So let's talk about what player-created formats need to survive. And really, I think there's 3 major things. Those 3 things are identity and curation, leadership, and organized play. So with the identity of a player-created format, obviously it needs some way to separate itself. Like, why would you play this format? What is this format offering that other formats aren't? Some of the ways that formats have done this is they have said, okay, well, this is recreating an era of Magic that was particularly popular and beloved by players. This would be something like Pre-Modern. Another way that formats have done this is that they have embraced some kind of underserved portion of the player base. This is one of the ways that Commander became so popular, is that it was serving a casual player base. At the time, had felt pretty underserved by how much attention Wizards of the Coast was paying to competitive players. And a lot of these things overlap with how you create a game generally, right? Like, what is the sort of value proposition that your game is offering, and the differentiators from other games that are part of the same genre. So next, I think these fan-made format, these player-created formats need leadership. They need some way for you to get information out about these formats. This can come in a lot of different flavors, I guess. Sometimes it's influencers. In the case of Canadian Highlander, Loading Ready Run seems to be the sort of influencer advocacy for that particular format. And this works for other Magic the Gathering formats too. Commander obviously has lots of YouTube channels that advocate for its playstyle. And even the Legacy format generally has quite a robust influencer community, right? With Bosch and Roll, Thraben U, and several others who create gameplay videos for the format. Pre-Modern is kind of the outlier here, where there doesn't seem to be a very clear like influencer representative for the format. yet. They have kind of piggybacked onto the sort of legacy community, where it's almost like a collection of eternal format players, where sometimes the legacy players also play things like vintage. And the last thing that a player-created format needs is it needs organized play. It needs some way for players to gather to play the format, because if nobody's playing the format might as well not exist, right? Normally, the way you would think about this is you're gathering a bunch of players into a singular location in person, and you're playing some kind of a tournament event, maybe a league, something like Friday Night Magic, or Star City Games has a big circuit of tournaments, or MagicCon, things like that. However, we've started to see these online leagues, and these are often ran through things like Discord, and they use webcam gameplay or things like Tabletop Simulator. There's a few different ways that you can play Magic specifically in an environment that is totally online, and we saw this really emerge during the pandemic with Commander. I do think that in-person events are probably the gold standard here, but another thing to keep in mind for allowing or having this format sort of catch on is that oftentimes they need to be proxy friendly, right? They need players to be able to get their hands on cards and really lower the barrier to entry for a lot of these formats, especially the ones that use particularly high-powered cards like CEDH. So let's take a look at a few relatively successful player-created formats and see how they have see how they fill out these three criteria. So first, let's take a look at Canadian Highlander, and I'm not well-versed in this format. I'm just aware of it through online discourse. So if I'm missing any details here, please let me know in the comments. Canadian Highlander players. Canadian Highlander is a 1v1 singleton format. Your decks consist of 100 cards where you can have one copy of each card. You have 20 life, which is similar to regular 60-card constructed Magic. There is no commander. There is no sideboard. It uses the same ban list as Vintage, and it is not a locked card pool, which means that new cards that come out can enter into this format. At a glance, it's not all that much different than Commander or Brawl, probably closer to Brawl considering it's a 1v1 format, other than it doesn't have a commander. It's still a Highlander type format where you can only have one copy of each card in your deck. Another thing that they do is they have this points list instead of a ban list, which I think is a pretty interesting idea, but basically because the format strives to share its ban list with the Vintage format, where you restrict cards, you don't necessarily ban them, but in a 100-card singleton format, every card is effectively restricted. So how do you then get granular with a way to restrict a card but not outright ban it? Well, you can give the cards a number of points, and then you can choose a point total to build your deck out of. It works kind of similar to like basically the way Warhammer works, where individual units are worth a certain number of points, and then you have like a 2,000 point army or something. In this instance, you might have like decks that have 10 points or 20 points. And then they have a list online that sort of curates individual point totals for cards that's updated periodically. The point total ban list situation with Canlander is kind of interesting because with a format that is sort of updated as often as it is, you do kind of need a way to get the word out about when changes have been made. You don't want players to show up to an event not having known that point totals have changed and now their deck might not be legal. And in terms of organized play for Canadian Highlander, I'm not sure about the online scene generally, other than Loading Ready Run does their North 100 series, which is a good way to showcase the format. But they also have in-person events. It sounds like Face-to-Face Games is kind of the main event organizer for Canadian Highlander in the areas where it's popular. Next, let's take a look at an emerging format in pre-modern. Pre-modern was just accepted into event rotation in Magic the Gathering Online, and most of the Magic Eternal formats, their communities are on Magic Online. And so with pre-modern sort of joining into the ranks of those Eternal formats, it really has legitimized the format in kind of an unprecedented way. So let's talk about the identity of pre-modern. Pre-modern was invented in 2012 by Martin Berlin. It is an Eternal non-rotating format, and it is also a locked card pool. It consists of the cards from 1993 to 2003, but it excludes any cards that have the new frame. It's also a 60-card constructed format that includes a 15-card sideboard that is played best 2 out of 3, just like most of the competitive formats in Magic the Gathering. Pre-Modern specifically is trying to recapture an early era of the standard format where the game moved at a much slower pace and also uses the old framed cards as a very clear visual indicator as a way to differentiate this format from other formats. They've also done some like curation of individual cards because they want to differentiate the play patterns from Legacy. So a host of cards have been banned to curate the play patterns of the format. This includes Brainstorm and Force of Will. These are sort of famous play patterns from the Legacy format specifically. In order to differentiate themselves and give themselves their own identity, they decided to ban those cards. So the thing that it seems like Pre-Modern is kind of missing at this point is influencer advocacy. We're starting to see some Eternal Magic players include Pre-Modern in their gameplay rotations. Channels like Bosch and Roll and 3BNU have played some amount of Pre-Modern on their channels, but there isn't really a dedicated influencer base to Pre-Modern. But if the format needed to do something like ban a card, then there is a community of influencers who would step up to basically distribute that information to the players. The other thing is that Magic Online can do some of that for the format as well, where if players are using Magic Online as their main method of playing the game, obviously Magic Online is maintained and will include the new ban list whenever something like that were to occur. The format does have sort of its flagship event in LobsterCon. LobsterCon in 2026 was a landmark event for the format. It drew 317 players to Cambridge, shattering the previous year's record of 280 players and becoming the largest pre-modern tournament ever held anywhere. With registration for the 320-player cap selling out in 90 seconds back in December. And they raised almost $20,000 for Room to Grow, which is a long-running charity partner for the event. Even though the event capped out at 317 players, sounds like 3 players weren't able to make it and they didn't resell the tickets for those seats. It sounds like the event could have been much larger than it was. 320 is a pretty substantial number of players for one event. But even then, it sounds like next year, if they have a bigger venue, the event will be able to be even bigger, which is great to see that the format has momentum and is moving forward. Finally, let's take a look at kind of an odd player-created format in the space in CEDH, because I think there's a lot for us to learn from the way that CEDH has grown as a grassroots format. CEDH kind of has this interesting split identity where I think the thing that attracts players to the format first and foremost is that it embraces the competitive side of a otherwise casual format in Commander. So instead of kind of like trying to recreate a particular time period in Magic the Gathering's history, instead they're doing what basically Commander did when it became a popular format by catering towards an underserved player base, by basically catering towards players who want to play Commander as their primary format, but don't want to use the traditional Rule Zero type casual play of Commander itself. And instead, they want to embrace the competitive nature of Magic the Gathering. There's a bit of a split identity here, though, in that CEDH kind of has 2 different camps, right? We have the sort of casual competitive, or what I call hard crust gamers, represented by channels like Play to Win. And then we have the tournament grinder side of CEDH, where they are basically trying to recreate some of the Pro Tour-esque tournaments that Magic the Gathering has been known for in the past. And I think in some ways that is almost trying to recapture that Pro Tour type gameplay of Magic in a kind of new way through free-for-all competitive multiplayer. There's a big problem, though, I think, with CEDH as a format generally, especially for the players that want to pursue the tournament side of things. And it is that the leadership of the format is wrapped up in Wizards of the Coast now. And even before that, the Commander, I forget which, Commander Rules Committee, I think was the one before. Now it's the Commander Advisory Group. No, it's the Commander Format Panel now, whatever. The entity that controlled the format before Wizards of the Coast took it over was not interested in curating the format for competitive play. They basically made one ban ever, which was in the card Flash. in order to help make CEDH even be a viable format at all. But generally speaking, they weren't interested in doing that and curating the format in that way. And now that the format has moved into Wizards of the Coast hands, they also don't really seem like they want to ban particular cards in the format for CEDH. And so you end up in this weird spot for CEDH, which is that you have a minority of the player base that wants to play the format in a particular way, but the majority of the player base doesn't have problems with the same cards that the competitive scene does. So something like Rhystic Study, which really should probably be banned for the competitive side of the game, is lingering on in the format because casual players can sort of self-police, right? They can decide whether or not their play group wants to play with these cards that are broken. CEDH, especially, again, the tournament version of this, ends up in a really rough spot when there's a problematic card in the format and there's nobody with authority to do anything about it in the tournament scene. And CEDH players generally have been very hesitant to kind of splinter off their format into its own thing. I'm not exactly sure what the reason why. The reasons I've heard, I think, are a little bit strange, but basically saying something like, well, if we splintered off into our own format, then CEDH, like, there's going to be players who don't have any, like, they're still going to want to play the most powerful cards, so they're going to stay playing regular Commander instead of moving to this format. And I'm like, I don't know. Tons of Magic formats have existed and succeeded. I don't really see any reason why CEDH wouldn't be able to have its own ban list and still have a player base. I don't know. This to me feels a little bit like curators who are more concerned with casual, right? Where you're going to have players who stick around in the casual format doing really powerful things instead of moving to CEDH. But I feel like the rules of the game are close enough that players will move into that competitive sphere if they want to, and then the format will just be curated better for them and make a lot more sense. So we'll see how that plays out down the road. But the other problem is that there really isn't a figurehead in that space, right? There's a lot of different CEDH events that are all managed by different people. And so it might be pretty difficult to get those people together now to solidify a vision for a ban list for CEDH. Okay, so there's some examples of various different player-created formats and how they've been succeeding in different ways. But all of them seem to be solving sort of those three criteria, right? What's the format identity? Who's the leadership of the format? And how are you handling the organized play? So finally, before we get into what I think the biggest problem is with pursuing this idea generally, is I want to talk a little bit about what I think a great format would be. So much of my time playing Magic the Gathering has been in the standard format, and something that I loved the most about it was that it was really dynamic. From a lot of what I've seen from these player-created formats is they tend to choose a period of time and kind of solidify them, right? They lock themselves off, and so the format doesn't really change all that much, and it becomes kind of an eternal format like pre-modern, where eventually the strategies kind of get figured out, and you still have a format and a meta that turns over, but you don't have really an influx of like new cards into the format, which I thought was something that was very exciting about the standard format generally. If I was to be looking to create a fan-made format, I would probably do something like take what I consider kind of the golden age of standard, which is somewhere between 2003 and 2006 up until somewhere around 2016, where the format received very few bans. This is also when the Escher stairwell technique was being executed to its most effective nature, I guess, where certain things in some sets would be powerful and less other things in that set would be less powerful. And then in the next set that's part of that sort of standard rotation, other things would be powerful and other things would be less powerful. So the sets would kind of fit together like puzzle pieces so that you wouldn't have any extreme power outliers in the format or like doubling up of things that are powerful like we're kind of seeing now with Standard's 3-year rotation. And I've talked about this on the channel before, so if you want to hear more about it, you can check out the Escher stairwell video. But I do think figuring out a way to recapture that rotation while keeping the format sort of encapsulated in time, because if you start to introduce cards from outside of that time period, they end up much more powerful, and so then you will get power outliers. One thing that's been kind of interesting watching MTG Goldfish with their best standard deck of all time series, and it's surprising to see that this window of time, the standard decks tend to be able to go up against each other, and you're not running into like something that's an extreme power outlier, even though the decks are from distinctly different eras in standard history. Now, you could run into some issues if you are allowing, like, let's say you're mimicking rotation, but you end up choosing two blocks that go together that do power stack on top of each other, and then you end up with some big extreme power outliers in the format. But if you're able to maintain that rotation, then that will inevitably rotate out. Now, there's always been a big problem with rotation in Magic, and it's that once your cards rotate, they're gone. You now would then have to change formats in order to play those cards again. But I think if you had a locked off card pool of a particular period of time and you're rotating through those sets consistently, a set that you had collected the powerful cards for would come back into rotation eventually. So maintaining your collection of cards becomes a viable option because you know eventually those cards will come back into the format and you'll already have them. Eventually, you would be able to own all of the staples of the format, and then as the sets are rotated through, you would have the game pieces you would need to build the decks, except there might be new emergent strategies that players hadn't thought of before as you combine these sets in new and interesting ways. I would also probably choose the 3-set block structure, so it'd probably maintain that period of time. And then you would kind of rotate through having a card pool that's 2 years worth of standard powered cards, and you would rotate them every so often while you're running some kind of a league, tournament circuit, or some kind of player championships, or something that will cap off that sort of league style play that would probably initially be handled through something like Discord. So while I think this is a compelling idea, let's get into some of the things that make me apprehensive about pursuing this idea. Biggest problem with fan-made formats is that you are effectively doing work for Wizards of the Coast for free. Basically, what I mean by that is that you are spending a lot of time finding a community of players, you're building this format around them, and then theoretically at some point you could have what might be considered a catastrophic success, which is kind of what has happened to Commander, right? Is that Wizards of the Coast saw that it was serving a player base, and a player base that was even bigger than the game that they had made, right, with sort of 60 card competitive standard as their sort of premier way to play the game. And they slowly but surely adopted the entire format and now are designing cards directly for that format, which has almost completely changed the original identity of Commander itself. I think you could look at that as kind of a catastrophic success, right? The initial identity and idea behind the format has been embraced fully by the company, which in some ways is a massive success, but also has caused all sorts of issues with the initial vision. There's another piece of the puzzle that we should look at here, and it's the way that Wizards of the Coast has supported D&D in the past. And I'll be brief because there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, but effectively, with 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, Wizards of the Coast created something called the Open Gaming License, which basically made it so that companies can create supplemental material for D&D using the Open Gaming License, and basically creating an ecosystem for creators to make content and profit off of that content. And this was very successful and spawned companies like Green Ronin and Paizo, Paizo being famous for having made Pathfinder. Pathfinder originally was part of the Open Gaming License, and they were creating supplemental material for Dungeons & Dragons. But when Wizards of the Coast switched to 4th edition D&D, they changed the agreement, basically, and it left Pathfinder kind of in a lurch. And so they went on and made their own game. Even more recently, Wizards of the Coast has changed the Open Gaming License again, and there was a huge uproar as they tried to change the contracts for these things, as they were seeing that the sort of supplemental materials that were being made for D&D started to become quite successful. And so Wizards of the Coast looked at that and said, hey, we want a piece of that pie. And so you end up in this weird situation where you're devoting a lot of time to designing and curating and supporting a format, which eventually could end up not under your control, right? And you end up in this weird gray area where Wizards of the Coast owns and designs the game pieces for the game, which are the cards, right? And you are effectively creating something that you don't really have control over. So while I think that player-created formats are the future for Magic the Gathering, and it is an exciting thing to see take place, and players really take ownership of the game more so than having it only be Wizards of the Coast deciding the various ways for us to play this game, I still have this apprehension of spending so much time and basically free labor for Wizards of the Coast for the ultimate success of the format to be one that is it being adopted by the company itself and then used and shifted in any kind of way for them to be able to make money with. It would be nice to see some way for Wizards of the Coast to create a mutually beneficial relationship here and, potentially incentivize players to create these formats and be able to have a more collaborative relationship with Wizards of the Coast in that way. Something like the open gaming license would be interesting. But as we've seen with the open gaming license, that agreement could kind of change at any time. But yeah, what do you think? Let me know in the comments. What did I miss about these player-created formats? It's a bit hard to track down all of the information on all of them because there's quite a few of them popping up as of late. It is an exciting time, and I do think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from making your own format. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you can join our Discord, where we have a large community of game designers where we're all working on our own games and custom magic and things like that. So if that's something that interests you, the link is in the description. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.